Imagine a world where all healthcare and education are completely equal and free. Here, the state provides a significant part of basic needs such as food and self-care every month, also free of charge. There is no distinction between the rich and poor. Everyone earns roughly the same salary. Status does not exist in this world, and young people do not have to worry about their future. Cuba is such a place. Let's take an imaginary trip there. First of all, this Latin nation, which is located in the Caribbean 150 kilometers south of the USA in the Atlantic Ocean, consists of more than 4,000 small islands and archipelagos, with an area of 109,884 square kilometers. It is the 8th largest island country in the world and the largest island in the Caribbean. Havana is both the capital and the largest city in the country. Although it is seen from the outside as a peaceful, colorful, and happy country full of dancing people, it has been struggling with the embargo imposed by the US for more than half a century. While the world is evolving and developing day by day, Cuba is always the same, as if stuck in a time loop, like it doesn't belong in this world, but in a different timeline of its own. In Cuba, which was excluded from the world economy due to the US embargo, time stopped in the 1960s, but life still flows very fast. Based on UNESCO's research, this situation made the country the most desired tourist destination globally. People want to see this magical environment of the past before it becomes modern. This tiny island nation with a 65-year history of revolution has a secret weapon that single-handedly challenges the superpower America. Before I tell you about the interesting and different life in the country, I must briefly talk about its history so that you can understand it better. First of all, Cuba is one of the few socialist countries with a one-party regime ruled by a communist party. The country was first declared as Spanish territory with the discovery of Christopher Columbus in 1492 and remained under Spanish colonization for about 4 centuries before becoming a US colony. Cuba gained its independence finally in 1902, but the country couldn't escape the influence of the United States. In 1933, the United States staged a coup and appointed Batista as the leader of the country. American companies controlled 2/3 of Cuba's agricultural land and the vast majority of its mineral resources. Cuba was both the source of raw materials and a vital market for the United States. Also, the American mafia had a voice in everything in the country. At that time, Cuba was among the fastest growing countries in the world. The main reason for this was the prohibition of alcohol in the US in 1919 and the influx of Americans to Cuba, with casinos, nightclubs, brothels, and hotels run by American mafias, as well as the drug trade. The distribution of income in the country has become very unequal. In the words of the poor Cuban people who were used as pawns by the United States, Cuba was the land of sins of the Americans. Fidel Castro believed that a revolution was inevitable. He started the revolution with Che Guevara in 1953 and overthrew the dictator Batista in 1959. The revolution completely changed the fate of the country. In a single night, all private businesses, houses, cars, everywhere, and everything in the country were publicized. The citizens were happy because all the wealth left by the Americans was distributed equally to the people. With the support of the Soviet Union, the society received free health care, education, shelter, food, and many other benefits. Before the revolution, only 10% of the people were partially able to read and write. In 1961, the government temporarily closed all schools and sent all teachers and students, a total of 100,000 people, to the countryside to teach the nation to read and write. Today, Cuba has one of the world's highest literacy rates, with a rate of 99.7. Half the tenants were made homeowners, so everyone could own a house. After 1 year, new houses were built and rented for no more than 10% of people's income. Over the years, everyone was able to own a house. While foreigners were banned from owning land in Cuba, the excess land of landowners with more than 402 hectares per person was expropriated and distributed to 200,000 landless peasants. Meanwhile, the United States was trying to weaken Cuba through military action and economic embargoes, and because of this, hundreds of thousands of Cubans fled from the revolution. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992, aid to the country stopped and things started to change. The country lost 80% of its foreign foreign trade instantly. The economy shrank by 60%, and the food distributed to the people was halved. So much so that Cubans lost 30% of their body weight. Food shortages began. Bakeries started making their bread from sweet potatoes because they had no flour. Even the electricity in the country was cut off for 4 hours every day. But social services were never charged. The country's economy was based solely on tobacco and sugar production for many years. 80% of the country's exports consisted of sugar. But now tourism was seen as the only way to revitalize the economy. And in 1993, the country opened its doors to other countries for the first time in Cuba. In fact, tourism was never planned. Even all the hotels were built for Cubans in the first place. The embargo that started with the revolution still continues today. Cuba is a country ostracized by almost the whole world because of the USA. The US has imposed conditions on the whole world, such as do not trade with Cuba. You cannot sell our goods to Cuba. If you trade with Cuba, you cannot trade with us. Or if your ship goes to Cuba, it cannot come to us for 6 months. If we look at the demographic structure of the country, the Cuban people have a culture blended with Spanish, African, and local traditions. The total population is about 11 million. According to official data, 64% of the population is white, 26% is multiracial, 9% is black, and 1% is of Asian origin. The country has no official religion. Even the country started to be known as an atheist country after the revolution. The most common belief is Catholicism, which was brought to the island by Spanish colonizers, and the second is Santeria, which was later introduced to Cuba by Africans. If we look at the daily life in the country has partially emerged from famine and impossibility and continues to live with its own means today. On average, people earn $30 to $40 a month. There is not a big difference between people's salaries. Whether you are a doctor or a waiter, you receive more or less the same salary. I gave the example of a doctor's salary because doctors are one of the highest paid professions in the country, which is around $50. Every neighborhood in the country is a slum. Class differences are almost zero. People are not struggling financially, but contrary to the tourists, they cannot fulfill their dreams. A tourist eats in a restaurant for $5 to $10, while Cubans earn an average of $30 to $40 per month. With a rationing system, people are provided with basic food aids such as meat, milk, rice, eggs, and flour, as well as personal care aids such as shampoo, soap, and deodorant every month. However, these supplies only meet a certain part of the citizens' basic needs. Obviously, in this country, people work for the Cuban state, and the state takes care of them up to a certain point. There are almost no homeless people on the streets. While 90% of the people live in their own houses, those who don't have a house live in state-provided lodgings. Of course, they are not luxurious lodgings. Almost all houses in the country are 50 or 60 years old. The furniture inside is the same. There are no technological devices such as washing machines, dishwashers, microwaves, and air conditioners. The state also covers bills such as electricity and water up to a certain amount. People are somehow happy with their lives because the country has no significant income inequality. However, the situation has started to change in recent years. Since 2010, the state has started to allow the private sector. In order to prevent income inequality, the country introduced an income tax after 45 years. Today, almost 35% of the country is working in the private sector. But when you think of the private sector, don't think of factories. Usually, these businesses are places like cafes and restaurants. Even if they are private, they are under government control. Contrary to popular belief, people here cannot enjoy themselves without working. They live by planning how much they will spend each month. Everyone has to do something in order to make a living in addition to the salary they receive from the state. Most of the country's land is devoted to tobacco. The vast majority of the people are engaged in tobacco business in their own homes and gardens. Before the private sector was allowed, people used to illegally sell products like ice cream and newspapers on the streets after work. Considering the circumstances, some people look for an easier way to make money, just like in every country. Since taxi drivers can earn even more than doctors, many people with cars have started to drive pirate taxis. And in this way, they can gain the money that a doctor can earn in 1 month in just 1 day or even in a few hours. When such situations emerged, the state tightened its control. Carrying foreigners in a car is a crime in the country. Also, the people cannot afford taxis in the country. Only tourists tourists have the privilege. The public usually uses buses for transportation, which are almost free. Engineers, doctors, journalists, and many others have given up their professions and started to work for tourists. Almost 80% of people live this way. Until 2011, Cubans were forbidden to buy and sell private property. In addition, since 2011, the government has allowed people to run their homes as hostels or restaurants. Called Casa Particular, these guest houses rent rooms for 25 to 50 euros per day. When this is the case and this business is legal, everyone in the country has become a tourism professional. By the way, those who have visited the country say that the Cuban people are very friendly and hospitable. Until 2012, Cubans were forbidden to travel abroad. Today, it is not forbidden, but the people do not have the money to afford it. Cubans who have never traveled abroad are therefore unable to fully compare their country with other countries. By the way, Cuba does not grant citizenship to foreigners in any way, including marriage, unless they were born in this land. Cubans who go abroad must return to their country every 2 years to not lose their citizenship. Banks and ATMs are not common in the country. Credit cards are not accepted in most places. The currency of the country has been the Cuban peso since 2021, and $1 is equal to 24 Cuban pesos. I said since 2021 because there were two different currencies used in the country for more than 20 years. Until today, the currencies were as follows: the Cuban peso used by the Cuban people and the convertible peso used by tourists. One convertible Cuban peso was equal to 24 Cuban pesos. For example, while pesos were used in buses, convertible pesos were used in taxis, restaurants, and hotels, which people could not afford to use. As much as Cuba is socialist to its own citizens, it is also a capitalist country to foreigners. The fact that it is still socialist is thanks to the tourism-driven economy. The country's official language is Spanish. Very few people speak English. The literacy rate in the country is very high, but there are no books, magazines, or newspapers for people to read and get information. There is no freedom of the press in the country anyway. The state monopolizes television, radio, and newspapers. They are not informed about the world as we are. The internet is both limited and very slow. In a world where our heads are increasingly leaning when using smartphones, this is a place where people still walk with their heads up. Until 2008, people were not even allowed to own computers and mobile phones. Until 2013, only tourists staying in hotels could access the internet. Mobile internet was introduced to the country in 2019. But considering that 5 gigabytes of internet is sold for $50, which is equivalent to the average Cuban's monthly salary, internet access is a luxury. Internet use in homes and workplaces became legal in 2019, but users must obtain a permit to have access. You may ask how people can have a phone when they have such an economy. Many Cubans have relatives living in the United States as a result of immigration in the past, and in this way, they can have a phone without saving money for years. For some Cubans, the most important source of additional income is their relatives living abroad. If they are lucky, these people can send them money. When you walk through the country streets, there are no billboards on your left or right, or the usual restaurants and cafes you can find in every other country. Everything and everywhere is unique here. Because of the embargo, the country still has a food problem. The supermarkets we are used to, where we can find everything, do not exist here. Most of the time, the shelves of the markets are either empty or consist of only one kind of product. Since the country has no industrialization, almost everything is imported, even biscuits. In addition, tourists are not allowed to shop because the prices are set by the state for the public. Cuba is one of the 3 countries in the world where Coca-Cola is not officially sold. Shopping malls were first opened here in 2017. These malls appeal more to tourists since they're not suitable for local budgets. Another occasion for tourists is hotels. It is unlikely for the public to stay in hotels except for work because their economy can't afford it. Although foreigners are allowed to invest in hotels in the country today, 51% of the hotels in the country are owned by the government. The management of the hotels must be Cuban, and also most of the employees are Cuban. The salaries of Cuban employees are paid by the government. One of the biggest economic problems of the people is that the government participates in everything. For example, you are a farmer and you want to eat your chickens, calves, or whatever it is. You have to get permission because the government even has rights on your animals. One of the things that comes to mind most when you think of Cuba is cigars. This is the country where the best quality cigars in the world are made, so much so that even the US president bought cigars from the country before the economic embargo was imposed there. Cuba is a very safe country compared to many countries, especially considering South America. Crime rates are very low in the country as the state supervision is strict and the rules are heavy. Here is the story of classic cars in the country. Most of these cars are American cars, and their original owners were Americans who left all their property in the country when the revolution started. Since the embargo, the US prohibited American cars from entering the country and Cuba was unable to produce cars. People have been driving the same cars ever since. Only after 1970, new cars from the Soviet Union started to arrive in the country, but these cars were distributed by the governments to workers and doctors. Until tourism began in the country in 1993, these cars were not worth much because they were old and were consuming a lot of gasoline. However, since there was a ban on importing and exporting these cars, they suddenly became valuable with the start of tourism. The sale of these cars is forbidden. It's a patrimony. The country has the best healthcare in terms of its income. The reason for its success in this field is that the country, which could not import medicines because of the embargo, had to start producing all its own medicines. With over 100,000 doctors, Cuba is one of the countries with the highest number of doctors per capita. Cuba sends doctors to some South American countries, especially Venezuela, to buy oil and some products they need. The government, which invests a lot in training doctors, thinks that a doctor who goes abroad will not come back because he can earn more there. So doctors are forbidden to go abroad without permission. Cancer and AIDS treatments are among the most successful in the country. They have developed a vaccine that slows down and stops lung cancer by allowing it to evolve into a chronic disease. In 2015, Cuba made history as the first country to prevent AIDS and syphilis passed from mother to child. A pioneer in health tourism, Cuba was the first country to cure polio and measles. Today, many diseases are no longer seen in the country. By the way, the country has the first and only vaccine developed against meningitis B in 1985. The success of Cuban doctors must have gained such a reputation in the world that the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation has put a monetary prize for intelligence gathering on Cuban doctors. It is really tragicomical that the U.S. is trying to bring Cuban doctors to their own country for high salaries while placing an embargo on the country in every field. The country has one of the lowest birth rates in the Western Hemisphere. Usually, 3 generations live in the same inherited house. Because it is economically very difficult for the government to build new houses and give them to the public. Therefore, since families cannot leave their houses to each child, they usually either have one child or do not prefer to have children. Since the government considers every born child its own, childcare education is compulsory for expectant mothers. After the child is born, there is no such thing as a private school. All educational institutions are state-owned, free, and equal. All the needs of the students, right down to the pen, are provided by the state. Also, theaters and concerts are free because music and art are considered to be people's rights. Even though more tourists means better income for the economy, it has also increased the public's internal unrest. Since the Cuban people realized that they did not have the luxurious life of the tourists, they started to question communism, so much so that some people think that the country may make a transition towards capitalism in the future. While people cannot live the way they want to in their own country, tourists are living their dreams in front of their eyes every day. These are the dreams that may seem simple to most people, such as taking a classic taxi, staying in hotels, or having a dinner out. Of course, the older people who have seen life before the revolution are very attached to the system they live in. Fidel Castro is a leader applauded for his anti-US stance, but condemned by human rights activists for his autocratic rule. Although he is the country's national hero, his monument and name are nowhere to be found. According to his will, it is forbidden to name streets, parks, and buildings after him, and to erect statues of him. By the way, Fidel Castro is the most assassination attempted person in history. He successfully survived 638 assassination attempts and wrote his name in the Guinness World Records. I will be uploading more videos about countries, so don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Sumeyra Cenet was here. See you in the next one. Bye.